My name is Isla, and I've spent 3 years learning how to breathe without her. 3 years since I walked away from the penthouse, from the woman who called herself Valeria but the world knew as El Shaka. 3 years of telling myself I made the right choice, that love wasn't enough to bridge the chasm between who she was becoming and who I needed her to be. I went back to my family's house in Merida, back to the simple life I thought I wanted. My parents welcomed me with open arms and careful questions they never quite asked. They could see the weight I carried, the way I would stare at news reports whenever violence erupted in Chiapas, scanning the footage for glimpses of a woman with dark eyes and a desert eagle. I finished my psychology degree online, throwing myself into understanding the human mind because I couldn't understand my own heart. How do you explain loving someone who kills for a living? How do you justify missing arms that have held weapons more often than they've held you? The textbooks had names for what Valeria experienced: childhood trauma, complex PTSD, attachment disorders stemming from witnessing her father's murder. They had clinical explanations for how a 6-year-old girl could become a 21-year-old killer. But none of those explanations helped me sleep at night when I dreamed of her smile, her laugh, the way she looked at me like I was the only beautiful thing in a world full of darkness. I tried dating other people. Nice, normal people with boring jobs and predictable problems. A teacher named Ricardo who brought me flowers and talked about his students. A nurse named Elena who volunteered at animal shelters on weekends. Good people who deserved better than someone constantly comparing them to a memory they could never measure up to. Because that's what Valeria had become, a memory. A beautiful, terrible, complicated memory of 2 weeks when I had loved someone so completely that everything else seemed like an echo of that feeling. The breaking point came 6 months after I left her. I was watching the evening news when a report came on about violence in northern Mexico. Cartel conflicts, they called it. Territorial disputes. As if the language could sanitize the blood and the fear and the families torn apart by bullets meant for someone else. The reporter mentioned Cartel de la Sierra, mentioned changes in leadership, mentioned a young woman known as El Shaka who had taken control and was implementing unprecedented reforms. They showed footage of a school opening, children cutting ribbons while armed guards watched from the shadows. They interviewed a doctor at a clinic who spoke about funding that came from private benefactors, everyone knew better than to name. I found myself crying without understanding why. Was I mourning the woman I had lost? Or was I proud of what she was becoming? Was I relieved that she seemed to be building something rather than just destroying, or was I heartbroken that she was doing it without me? My mother found me on the kitchen floor, sobbing into a dish towel like a teenager whose first love had moved away. Mija, she said, sitting down beside me with the patience of someone who had raised 4 daughters through various romantic disasters. Tell me about her. So I did. I told her about the mysterious woman who ate chocolate every evening like it was a religious ritual. About the car that cost more than our house, the way she deflected personal questions, the sadness that lived behind her eyes like a permanent resident. I told her about the gunshot wound, about the 2 weeks in the hospital when I held vigil over someone whose real name I didn't even know. About the kiss that tasted like desperation and promise, and the beginning of something I had never experienced before. I told her about the truth that came pouring out in that hospital room, about the little girl who watched her father die, about the 15 years of violence that followed, about the chocolate that connected her to the only pure love she had ever known. I told her about the months afterward, about trying to love someone who lived in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, where phone calls meant crisis and silence might mean death. About watching the woman I loved disappear piece by piece into a role that demanded everything and gave back only emptiness. My mother listened to all of it without judgment, without the questions I had expected about why I would involve myself with someone so dangerous. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Do you still love her?" she finally asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Even though I shouldn't. Even though she's probably forgotten me by now. Even though loving her nearly destroyed me." "Then why did you leave?" "Because staying was destroying her too. She was trying so hard to be both the woman I fell in love with and the leader her people needed. She was tearing herself apart trying to keep everyone happy, and it wasn't working." "And now?" I thought about the news reports, about the schools and clinics, about the subtle changes in how Cartel de la Sierra was described in the media. Less focused on violence, more focused on territorial expansion through economic development. Still criminal, still dangerous, but evolving into something more complex than simple brutality. Now I think maybe she's figured out how to be both, I said. Or maybe she's decided to be someone new entirely. That night, I started writing letters I never intended to send. Letters where I told Valeria about my day, about the psychology classes I was taking, about the normal life I was building while thinking about her constantly. Letters where I admitted that leaving had been both the right choice and the worst mistake of my life. I wrote about how I watched the news for mentions of her, how I scanned obituaries in Mexican newspapers because I was terrified of finding her name. I wrote about the dreams where we were different people living simpler lives, where she was a farmer's daughter who had never learned to kill and I was brave enough to love her without conditions. I wrote about the guilt I carried for abandoning her when she needed me most, for choosing my own emotional safety over standing by someone who had trusted me with the truth of her brokenness. I wrote about the anger I felt at a world that could turn a 6-year-old girl into a weapon, about systems that failed people like Valeria so completely that crime became their only path to safety. The letters filled 3 notebooks. Some nights I would read them back to myself and cry. Other nights I would consider actually sending them, but I never knew what address to use. How do you mail a letter to someone whose life requires constant movement, constant vigilance, constant transformation? Year 2 brought news that Cartel de la Sierra was expanding internationally. Not through violence, according to the reports, but through legitimate business partnerships and humanitarian initiatives. They were building infrastructure in Guatemala, funding disaster relief in Honduras, establishing educational programs in Colombia. I found myself oddly proud of these developments, as if I had somehow contributed to Valeria's evolution simply by loving her enough to demand better. But pride was complicated by worry. Expansion meant more enemies, more complexity, more reasons for someone to put a bullet in her head. I started carrying my phone everywhere, checking news apps compulsively, jumping every time an unknown number called. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that Valeria de Castillo could take care of herself better than almost anyone alive. But logic is a poor comfort when your heart is afraid. The closest I came to reaching out was when I heard about an attempt on her life. Sketchy reports from usually reliable sources suggested that El Shaka had been ambushed in Monterrey, that she had fought her way out but sustained injuries. For 48 hours, I knew nothing except that she might be dead. I called the hospital where we had met, hoping someone might have information. The nurse who answered recognized my voice. "She's not here, Mija," she said gently. "But if she were, she would want to know you were asking about her." I spent those 2 days unable to eat, unable to sleep, pacing my apartment like a caged animal. When the next reports confirmed that El Shaka was alive and had eliminated her attackers in characteristic fashion, I collapsed with relief so profound it scared me. This was not healthy. This was not the normal life I had claimed to want. This was obsession disguised as concern, love poisoned by helplessness and distance. I made an appointment with a therapist. Dr. Restrepo was a woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma recovery and relationship counseling. I told her I was struggling with the aftermath of a complicated relationship, which was true enough without requiring specifics about cartels and contract killings. "Tell me about the person you loved," she said during our first session. "She was broken," I began. "Traumatized as a child, forced into a life she never would have chosen. But underneath all that damage, she was incredibly strong, incredibly loyal. She would have done anything to protect the people she cared about." "What attracted you to her?" I thought about Valeria in that restaurant, eating chocolate like it was a sacrament, looking at me like I was something precious and unexpected. "Her vulnerability," I said finally. She was this powerful, dangerous woman, but when she let her guard down, she was just someone who had been hurt too much and was trying to figure out how to trust again. "And what made the relationship difficult?" "Her work. Her responsibilities. The fact that loving her meant accepting a world where violence was always possible, where I might lose her at any moment to someone else's bullet or ambition." Dr. Restrepo nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you were dating someone in a high-risk profession. Military? Law enforcement?" "Something like that," I said, grateful for the easier explanation. How did it end? I left. I told her I needed someone who could prioritize our relationship, who could give me the stability and presence I needed. She couldn't do that, so I walked away. Do you regret leaving? The question I had been asking myself for 2 years. Do I regret choosing my own emotional health over standing by someone who was fighting battles I couldn't even comprehend? Do I regret demanding normalcy from someone whose life was built on controlled chaos? Yes and no, I said. I regret hurting her. I regret not being strong enough to love her unconditionally. But I don't regret recognizing my own limitations and protecting myself from a situation that was destroying me. That sounds very healthy, Dr. Restrepo said. Self-preservation isn't selfish when you're dealing with someone whose lifestyle puts constant stress on your relationship. Over the months that followed, she helped me understand that loving Valeria hadn't been a mistake, but staying indefinitely would have been. That you can love someone deeply while still acknowledging that you're not compatible long-term. That leaving doesn't mean you loved less. Sometimes it means you loved enough to recognize when the situation wasn't sustainable for either of you. The therapy helped. I stopped checking news reports obsessively. I went on a few more dates, though none led to anything serious. I focused on my career, accepting a position at a community mental health center where I could use my psychology degree to help people dealing with trauma and difficult life transitions. But I never stopped loving her. Even when months passed without thinking about her consciously, she was there in the background of my thoughts, a permanent resident of my heart that I had learned to live around rather than trying to evict. Year 3 brought changes I couldn't ignore. The news reports about Cartel de la Sierra shifted tone completely. Where once they focused on violence and territorial disputes, now they discussed economic development projects and humanitarian initiatives. International business journals started featuring articles about innovative approaches to corporate social responsibility in emerging markets, though they never quite named the organization behind the funding. I recognized Valeria's influence in these changes. The strategic thinking, the long-term vision, the understanding that sustainable power came through building rather than destroying. She was applying lessons learned from violence to the more complex challenge of creating lasting positive change. But the reports also suggested she was paying a personal price for these achievements. Interviews with anonymous sources described a young leader who worked 18-hour days, who had sacrificed personal relationships for professional responsibilities, who carried the weight of thousands of people's livelihoods with a dedication that bordered on self-destruction. I found myself worrying about her again, but differently this time. Not fear that she would be killed by enemies, but concern that she was killing herself through exhaustion and isolation. The woman I had loved was capable of incredible self-sacrifice, but she had never learned healthy boundaries between her own needs and everyone else's. The synchronicities started small. A chocolate commercial on television featuring the same brand she used to eat religiously. A news story about infrastructure development in Chiapas that mentioned a town I recognized from her childhood stories. A song on the radio with lyrics about finding your way back to someone you should never have lost. Then came the dreams. Not the usual dreams where I processed my own emotions about our relationship, but something different. Dreams where I saw Valeria sitting alone in expensive restaurants, eating chocolate that didn't seem to bring her comfort anymore. Dreams where she stood on balconies high above cities, looking down with the expression of someone contemplating whether the fall would hurt. I woke from these dreams with my heart racing, convinced that something was wrong. But what was I supposed to do with that intuition? Call the Mexican police and explain that I was psychically connected to a cartel leader? Fly to Chiapas and hope to randomly encounter someone who lived surrounded by security and secrecy? The answer came from an unexpected source, my youngest sister Carmen, who had always been more spiritually oriented than the rest of our family. You're dreaming about her because she's thinking about you, she said matter-of-factly when I described the recurring images. Strong emotional connections don't just disappear because of physical distance. That's not how psychology works, I protested, falling back on my clinical training. Psychology explains the mind, Carmen replied. I'm talking about the heart. About the kind of bond that forms when two people see each other completely and choose to love anyway. Even if that's true, what am I supposed to do about it? Listen to what the dreams are telling you. If she's as isolated and self-destructive as you think, maybe she needs to know that someone still believes in the woman she is underneath all the responsibilities. I can't just show up in her life after 3 years. She's probably moved on, probably doesn't even think about me anymore. Carmen gave me the patient look she reserved for when I was being deliberately obtuse. Isla, you've spent 3 years of your life unable to fully invest in anyone else because part of your heart is still with her. Do you really think someone who loved you as intensely as she did just forgot you existed? That night, I dreamed of Valeria again. But this time, instead of seeing her alone and isolated, I saw her in a familiar setting, the restaurant in Merida where we had first met. She was sitting at the same table, eating chocolate with the same ritual precision, but something was different. Instead of the guarded wariness I remembered, there was a kind of peaceful resignation, as if she had finally made peace with carrying her burdens alone. I woke knowing, with certainty I couldn't explain or rationalize, that she was going to call me. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was grading patient intake forms at the community center. An unknown number with a Mexican area code that I almost didn't answer because I was busy and tired and not in the mood for spam calls. Something made me pick up anyway. Hello. Silence. Then, in a voice that was older and wearier but unmistakably hers, hi. It's me. My hands started shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. 3 years of wondering, 3 years of dreaming, 3 years of carrying her memory like a secret weight, and suddenly she was there, real and present and nervous in a way that made her sound more like the woman I had fallen in love with and the legend she had become. Valeria. I know I don't have the right to call after all this time. I know you've probably moved on, built the normal life you wanted. But I needed to tell you something. I closed my eyes and listened to her voice, cataloging the changes. More confident than before, but also more measured. Like someone who had learned to choose her words carefully because they carried weight beyond personal conversations. She talked about learning to carry responsibility better, about holding on to the parts of herself that mattered. She mentioned chocolate and dreams and her father's guidance. She talked about funding schools because she remembered powerlessness, about wanting to give other people choices she had never had. I'm not the same person you fell in love with, she said. That woman was broken and angry and barely holding herself together. But I'm not completely different either. I still believe in love, even though I gave up on it for a while. I still believe in building something better, even though the methods are complicated. I still believe that maybe somehow, someone can love both the woman I was and the leader I've become. The vulnerability in her voice undid me completely. This wasn't El Shaka making a strategic phone call. This was Valeria, the woman who had kissed me desperately in a hospital room and confessed secrets that could have gotten us both killed. Where are you? I asked, my own voice barely steady. Merida. At our restaurant. Our restaurant. As if 3 years hadn't passed, as if we were still two people who shared places and memories and inside jokes. As if love could survive absence and transformation and all the reasons we had been wrong for each other. I'll be there in an hour. I hung up before I could change my mind, before logic could intervene and remind me of all the reasons this was a terrible idea. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and drove toward the center of town, toward a conversation that would either heal 3 years of heartache or break what was left of my heart completely. The drive gave me time to think, to process what I was about to do. Was I walking back into the same impossible situation I had fled 3 years ago? Had anything really changed, or was I just desperate enough to convince myself that it had? But underneath the practical concerns was a deeper truth I couldn't ignore. I had never stopped loving her. Despite therapy and other relationships and 3 years of trying to move forward, part of me had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when she would reach out and ask if there was still room in my life for someone as complicated as her. The answer, I realized as I pulled into the restaurant parking lot, was yes. It had always been yes. She was sitting at the same table where I had first approached her 3 years ago, but everything else was different. Valeria looked older, more composed, like someone who had grown into authority rather than simply wielding it. Her clothes were expensive but understated, her posture confident without being aggressive. She had learned to carry power more gracefully, to wear responsibility like a well-tailored suit rather than armor that didn't quite fit. But when she saw me walking toward her, when her eyes met mine across the restaurant, she smiled with the same wonder I remembered from that first night. Like I was still something beautiful and unexpected in a world that had shown her too much darkness. I sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other, cataloging changes and similarities, trying to bridge 3 years of separation with eye contact and nervous breathing. "You look good," she said finally. "Happy. Settled." "You look tired," I replied, because it was true. Successful, powerful, more at peace with herself than before, but tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "I am tired," she admitted. "But it's different now. Before I was tired because I was fighting against everything, my past, my responsibilities, the person I was becoming. Now I'm tired because I'm working towards something instead of just surviving day by day." "Tell me about it. About what you've built." So she did. Not the clinical details from news reports, but the personal story behind the statistics. How she had transformed her father's legacy from simple criminal enterprise into something more complex and ultimately more beneficial. How she had learned to use violence strategically rather than reactively, to build economic opportunities alongside territorial control. She talked about schools that taught children their history alongside practical skills, about clinics that provided healthcare to people government programs couldn't reach, about agricultural cooperatives that gave farmers alternatives to growing coca. She talked about the delicate balance between legitimate business and illegal activities, about making compromises that would have horrified her younger self but served a greater good. "It's not perfect," she said. "I'm still responsible for things that cause harm. People die because of decisions I make, families are torn apart, communities are disrupted. But more people live because of what we've built. More children get educated, more families have economic opportunities, more communities have protection from worse alternatives. Do you ever regret it? Taking on all this responsibility?" Valeria considered the question while eating a piece of chocolate, the same ritual I remembered but performed with less desperate hunger and more conscious appreciation. "I regret what it cost," she said finally. "I regret losing people I cared about, losing parts of myself I can never get back. But I don't regret the work itself. Someone had to do it, and I was in a position to do it better than most people would have." "What did it cost?" She looked at me then with an expression that held 3 years of loneliness and determination and sacrifice. "You," she said simply. "It cost me you. And that was the highest price I've ever paid for anything." The honesty of it took my breath away. No self-pity, no attempt to minimize her own choices, just acknowledgement that pursuing her larger mission had required giving up the thing she had wanted most. "I made that choice," I said. "You didn't drive me away. I left because I wasn't strong enough to love you unconditionally." "You were strong enough," Valeria corrected. "You were strong enough to recognize that what I was asking from you wasn't fair. You were strong enough to protect yourself when I couldn't protect both of us." "Do you think?" I started, then stopped, afraid to voice the question that had brought me here. "Do I think what?" "Do you think there's a way for this to work now? For us to work?" Valeria reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers warm and calloused and steady. "I think I'm finally in a position to offer you something real," she said. "Not just stolen moments between crises, not just pieces of myself left over after everyone else's needs are met. Something sustainable." "What does that look like?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know I want to find out. I know that 3 years of having everything I thought I wanted wasn't worth 3 minutes without you. I know that all the power and success and positive change in the world feels empty when there's no one to share it with who understands the cost." I squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses that told stories of violence and the gentleness that had somehow survived everything she'd had to do. "I want to try," I said. "But I need honesty. Complete honesty. No more protecting me from the truth of what your life requires. Even if that truth is ugly? Especially then. I can't love half of you, Valeria. I can't love just the parts that are easy to accept. If we're going to do this, I need to love all of you, the leader and the killer, the visionary and the pragmatist, the woman who builds schools and the woman who eliminates threats. She was quiet for a long time, studying my face like she was trying to memorize it. "That's a lot to ask of someone," she said finally. "You're a lot of person," I replied. "But I knew that when I fell in love with you the first time. Maybe I just needed 3 years to figure out how to be brave enough for it." Valeria didn't ease me back into her world gradually. When I said I needed complete honesty, she took me at my word. The next morning, she took me to see her current operation, not the public-facing humanitarian projects or legitimate businesses, but the machinery that funded everything else. A distribution center where cocaine was packaged and shipped to markets across North America, staffed by people who treated the work with professional efficiency rather than glamour or shame. "This is what pays for everything," she said as we watched workers in hazmat suits handling product worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The schools, the clinics, the infrastructure projects, the legitimate businesses that employ thousands of people, all of it depends on this. I watched the operation with the clinical detachment I had learned in graduate school, studying the human systems at work rather than judging the moral implications. These weren't the desperate criminals from action movies. These were employees doing skilled labor for good wages, supporting families and communities that had few other economic options. "How do you reconcile it?" I asked. "I don't," Valeria said. "I stopped trying to reconcile contradictions and started focusing on net outcomes. This operation directly funds programs that improve tens of thousands of lives. The drugs we ship, they were going to reach those markets anyway. At least this way, the profits serve something beyond individual enrichment. What about the people who use those drugs? The families destroyed by addiction? What about the families destroyed by poverty? The children who die from preventable diseases because there's no healthcare infrastructure? The teenagers who join gangs because there are no educational opportunities?" She wasn't defensive, just tired. "I can't solve every problem, Isla. I can't save everyone from every form of harm. All I can do is try to create more good than harm within the systems I have access to." It was a sophisticated moral framework, more nuanced than the simple good versus evil narratives I had grown up with. But it required a kind of emotional compartmentalization I wasn't sure I could manage. That afternoon, she showed me the other side, a new medical clinic serving 3 remote villages, a technical school teaching renewable energy installation, a reforestation project that would provide jobs while addressing environmental degradation. Projects that would have been impossible without the illegal funding, but created unmistakably positive change in people's lives. "This is what I mean about building something better," she said as we watched students learning to install solar panels. Not just replacing one form of exploitation with another, but actually expanding opportunities and possibilities. "And if the government shuts it down? If new policies or rival organizations disrupt the funding? Then we adapt. We find new approaches, new sources of revenue, new ways to serve the same goals. The specific methods matter less than the underlying commitment to building rather than just extracting." That evening, back at her current residence, a fortified compound that managed to feel like a home despite the security measures, she showed me the personal cost of maintaining this balance. Charts covering one wall tracked economic indicators, violence statistics, and social development metrics across her territory. Another wall was covered with photographs, every person who had died in conflicts under her leadership, every civilian casualty, every unintended consequence of her strategic decisions. "I remember all of them," she said, standing before the memorial wall. "Not just the numbers, but their names, their families, the specific circumstances that led to their deaths. It's important to remember the cost, even when the alternative would have been worse." "How do you sleep at night?" "Some nights I don't," she said simply. "Some nights I sit here and add new photographs to the wall and wonder if there was a different choice I could have made. But then morning comes, and there are new decisions to make, new problems to solve, new opportunities to create something better than what was there before." The honesty was overwhelming. Not just the facts of her situation, but the emotional reality of carrying responsibility for so many lives, so many complex calculations, so many moral gray areas where perfect choices didn't exist. Valeria invited me to stay at the compound while I decided whether I could handle re-entry into her world. My own apartment in Merida suddenly seemed impossibly naive and simple, a place where the hardest decisions involved which patients to prioritize and how to manage my own work-life balance. Here, I woke each morning to briefings about overnight developments across 3 countries. Drug shipments intercepted by authorities, requiring immediate replacement to maintain supply chain obligations. Government officials requesting meetings to discuss expanded development projects. Intelligence reports about rival organizations testing territorial boundaries. I watched Valeria navigate these challenges with a combination of strategic thinking and emotional intelligence I had never seen before. She could authorize violence when necessary while maintaining genuine care for the people implementing her decisions. She could negotiate complex business deals while never losing sight of their impact on local communities. But I also watched the toll it took. The way she would sometimes stop mid-conversation, overwhelmed by the cascade of decisions requiring her attention. The careful way she ate, as if food was fuel rather than pleasure. The hypervigilance that meant she never fully relaxed, even in the most secure environments. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," I told her one evening after a particularly difficult day involving a government crackdown that had disrupted several humanitarian projects. "I have advisors," she said. "I have a whole organization of people helping me make these decisions." "That's not what I mean." She looked at me then with something like vulnerability, though she tried to hide it behind her usual composed expression. "I don't know how to share this burden with someone who isn't already part of this world," she admitted. "I don't know how to love someone without putting them at risk, how to maintain a relationship when every decision I make could have life or death consequences for thousands of people." "Then let me learn," I said. "Teach me how your world works, what you need from a partner, how I can support you without getting in the way." "It's dangerous," she warned. "Not just the obvious physical risks, but the moral complexity. Once you're inside this system, you become complicit in everything it requires. You can't maintain innocence or distance." "I don't want innocence," I told her. "I want understanding. I want to love you with full knowledge of who you are and what you do, not in spite of it but including it." So she began teaching me. I learned about the economic networks that sustained their operations, the political relationships that provided protection and legitimacy, the social programs that created genuine community investment. I learned about security protocols, communication systems, the careful choreography of living under constant potential threat. More importantly, I learned about the human relationships that made it all possible. The loyalty earned through consistent fair treatment, the respect built through competent leadership, the trust created by following through on commitments even when it was costly or difficult. People don't follow you just because they're afraid of you, I observed after sitting in on several strategy meetings. "Fear is useful for immediate compliance," Valeria agreed. "But loyalty requires something more. It requires feeling like you're part of something meaningful, something that serves purposes beyond just enriching the people at the top." "Is that what your father understood? What made him different from other cartel leaders?" "According to my uncle, yes. Papa saw the difference between power over people and power with people. He understood that sustainable influence comes from creating systems where everyone benefits, not just the person making the decisions." "And Gustavo didn't understand that?" "Gustavo understood it intellectually, but he couldn't implement it emotionally. He saw other people as tools to be used rather than partners to be respected. That's why his coup failed. He had followers, but not allies." I was learning not just about Valeria's world, but about leadership itself. About the difference between authority and influence, between control and collaboration, between managing people and inspiring them. 3 weeks into my education, Valeria made me an offer I hadn't expected. "I want you to consider taking a formal role in the organization," she said over dinner in her private quarters. "Not in operations, you don't have the background or temperament for that side of things. But in the humanitarian division, using your psychology training to help us develop more effective community programs." I nearly choked on my wine. "You want me to become part of Cartel de la Sierra?" "I want you to become part of what we're building," she clarified. The legitimate development work, the social programs, the long-term projects that are slowly replacing our dependence on illegal activities. That's still part of the same organization. Yes, she said simply. It is. And if you take this role, you'll be complicit in everything we do, good and problematic alike. You'll be professionally associated with an organization that traffics drugs and eliminates rivals and corrupts government officials. You'll also be professionally associated with an organization that's built more schools and clinics in rural Mexico than the last 3 presidential administrations combined. The offer was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. Using my psychology training to develop trauma-informed educational programs, community mental health initiatives, social services that addressed root causes of violence and desperation, it was work I had trained for, work that could make a real difference in people's lives. But it would also mean crossing a line I could never uncross. Once I became a formal member of Valeria's organization, I would lose any claim to moral neutrality or legal innocence. I would become, in the eyes of law enforcement and society, a criminal. Why are you asking me this? I said. Because I want you in my life permanently, Valeria said. Not as a girlfriend who visits occasionally, not as someone I have to protect from the truth of what I do. As a full partner in building something meaningful. And if I say no? Then we continue as we have been. You stay as long as you're comfortable, leave when you need to, and I try not to let it destroy me again when you go. The honesty was brutal and generous at once. She wasn't trying to manipulate me or pressure me into choosing her over my own moral boundaries. She was simply offering me a path to full integration into her world, while acknowledging that the cost might be more than I was willing to pay. Can I think about it? Take as much time as you need, she said. But understand that this offer comes with an expiration date. The longer you're here learning about our operations, the more security risk you represent if you ultimately decide to leave. At some point, trust becomes a safety issue for everyone involved. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine my life in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Did I see myself growing old in academia or government service, helping people one case at a time while larger systemic problems remained unchanged? Or did I see myself here, part of an organization that operated outside legal boundaries but inside moral ones, working to address root causes rather than just symptoms? The answer, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. I told Valeria yes on a Thursday morning while she was reviewing security reports and eating her daily chocolate. She looked up at me with surprise and something that might have been relief. Are you sure? She asked. Once you're formally part of this, there's no going back to your old life. You'll be legally compromised, professionally compromised, morally compromised. Every government agency that considers me a threat will consider you one too. I'm sure, I said, and realized I meant it completely. I've spent 3 years trying to build a life without you, and it never felt authentic. This feels authentic. Complicated and dangerous and morally ambiguous, but real in a way nothing else has been. She set down her reports and came around the desk to hold me, and for the first time since I had returned to her world, I felt her truly relax. Welcome to Cartel de la Sierra, she said against my hair. Welcome to the family business. The formal initiation happened that afternoon. Not a ceremony or ritual, but a series of practical steps that transformed me from observer to participant. I signed documents that established my legal identity within the organization, received security clearances that gave me access to classified information, accepted communication devices that connected me to networks I had never imagined existed. By evening, I was officially Dr. Isla Morales, Director of Community Psychology for Cartel de la Sierra's Humanitarian Division. My psychology degree, which I had earned to understand human behavior in safe, clinical settings, was now being applied to questions of trauma recovery in war zones and community resilience in areas where government support was minimal or non-existent. Any regrets yet? Valeria asked as we shared dinner in her private quarters, our first meal as official partners in both love and crime. Ask me in a year, I said, when I've seen more of what this life actually requires. She laughed, but there was nervousness underneath the humor. I hope you'll still be here in a year. Where else would I go? I just committed several felonies by joining your organization. My career options have become somewhat limited. You could always turn state's evidence, she said, only half joking. Cooperate with law enforcement, help bring down the evil cartel boss who corrupted the innocent psychologist. Is that what you think this is? Me being corrupted by you? Valeria considered the question while sipping wine that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. I think this is two people who love each other finding a way to build something together despite impossible circumstances, she said finally. Whether that's corruption or evolution, I guess we'll find out. My first assignment was conducting psychological assessments of potential recruits to the humanitarian division. People with social work backgrounds, education experience, healthcare training, individuals who wanted to do meaningful work but couldn't find adequate opportunities through traditional employment. The interviews revealed a consistent pattern. Talented, idealistic people who had been frustrated by bureaucracy, limited resources, and systemic obstacles to actually helping communities in need. They weren't drawn to Cartel de la Sierra by the criminality, but by the possibility of doing work that mattered with adequate funding and organizational support. It's easier to get forgiveness than permission, explained Rosa, a former government social worker who had become one of our most effective program coordinators. When you work for official agencies, you spend 70% of your time on paperwork and 30% on actual service. Here, it's reversed. Don't you worry about the moral implications? I asked. Working for an organization involved in drug trafficking? Rosa gave me a look I was learning to recognize, the expression of someone who had made peace with moral complexity through lived experience rather than theoretical frameworks. My daughter has asthma, she said. The government clinic in our town had one inhaler last month. One. For a community of 3,000 people. The clinic we built here has a full pharmacy and 2 respiratory specialists on staff. You tell me which system is more moral. These conversations forced me to confront my own assumptions about ethics and social responsibility. I had been trained to think in terms of individual pathology and therapeutic intervention, but the people I was meeting dealt with systemic problems that couldn't be solved through traditional counseling approaches. Valeria noticed my struggle during one of our evening debriefings. You're thinking like a therapist, she said. Individual clients, individual problems, individual solutions. But the issues we're addressing are structural, community-wide, generational. The psychology is still important, but it has to be applied at a different scale. How do you mean? Take trauma recovery. In your old job, you would work with one person at a time to process their individual experiences. Here, we're dealing with communities where entire generations have experienced violence, displacement, economic devastation. You can't address that one therapy session at a time. She showed me reports from our educational programs, our community development projects, our healthcare initiatives. All of them incorporated trauma-informed approaches, but at a population level rather than individual treatment. We're not just treating symptoms, she explained. We're addressing the social conditions that create and maintain psychological distress. Economic opportunity, physical security, access to education and healthcare, community cohesion, all of that affects mental health more powerfully than individual therapy ever could. It was a sophisticated understanding of public health psychology, applied through channels that no academic program had ever taught me about. I found myself energized by the scope and complexity of the work in ways my previous career had never achieved. But the moral compromises were constant and exhausting. Every program we funded came from revenue generated through illegal activities. Every community we helped was also a community where our organization maintained territorial control through the implicit threat of violence. Every success story was built on a foundation of activities I had been raised to consider fundamentally wrong. How do you live with the contradictions? I asked Valeria one night after a particularly difficult day reviewing the psychological profiles of children in our educational programs, brilliant, hopeful kids whose opportunities depended on drug money. I stopped trying to resolve them, she said. I started focusing on net outcomes instead of moral purity. These children are getting educated. Their families have economic opportunities. Their communities have infrastructure and healthcare. The source of the funding doesn't change those facts. But it might change the long-term sustainability. What happens if law enforcement disrupts the drug operations? What happens to all these programs if your illegal revenue disappears? Then we adapt. We find new funding sources, transition more operations to legitimate businesses, develop government partnerships that can maintain the programs through official channels. But in the meantime, we don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I was beginning to understand why she looked so tired all the time. The mental energy required to constantly weigh competing moral claims, to make decisions that affected thousands of lives while accepting that no choice would be perfect. It was exhausting in ways I had never experienced. 6 months into my new role, I faced my first real test of loyalty. A rival organization had kidnapped 3 teachers from one of our schools, demanding that we cease educational operations in a disputed territory. The teachers were civilians, non-combatants who had no involvement in cartel activities beyond accepting employment in schools we funded. Valeria called an emergency strategy meeting to discuss response options. I expected the conversation to focus on negotiation, ransom payment, diplomatic solutions that might secure the teacher's release without escalating violence. Instead, I listened to detailed discussions of tactical assault options, intelligence gathering on the kidnapper's location, and risk assessments for various military responses. These weren't abstract strategic conversations. They were planning sessions for operations that would likely result in multiple deaths. What about negotiation? I asked when there was a pause in the tactical discussion. The room went quiet. 15 hardened criminals and strategic planners looked at me with expressions ranging from patience to barely concealed contempt. Negotiation signals weakness, explained Javier, one of Valeria's most trusted lieutenants. If we pay ransom for these teachers, every rival organization will start kidnapping our people. It becomes an industry. But these are innocent civilians. They didn't choose to be part of this conflict. None of us chose to be part of this conflict, Valeria said quietly. But here we are. And the choice isn't between violence and peace, it's between immediate violence that protects our people and delayed violence that encourages more attacks. You're talking about killing people. I'm talking about protecting our community, she corrected. Those teachers have families who depend on our schools, children who look up to them, communities that trust us to keep them safe. If we don't respond decisively, that trust disappears, and everything we've built falls apart. I left the meeting feeling sick to my stomach, but also recognizing the logic behind their decision. In a world where government protection was minimal and rival organizations used violence as standard operating procedure, passive responses could indeed encourage more aggression. The assault happened that night. 3 hours of carefully coordinated violence that resulted in the teachers being rescued and 7 members of the rival organization being killed. No casualties among our people, no harm to the civilians, no ambiguity about our willingness to protect the communities we served. I should have felt relieved that the teachers were safe. Instead, I found myself thinking about the 7 dead men, someone's sons, brothers, fathers, men who had probably joined criminal organizations for the same reasons of limited options and economic desperation that motivated our own recruits. This is what it means to be part of this world, Valeria told me the next morning when she found me staring out the window instead of eating breakfast. Not just the humanitarian programs and community development, but the violence that makes those programs possible. I know, I said. Intellectually, I understand the logic. But emotionally, you're a good person who was raised to believe that taking human life is always wrong, she finished. That's one of the things I love about you. But it's also something you'll need to reconcile if you're going to stay here. How did you reconcile it? By remembering that moral purity is a luxury I can't afford if I want to protect the people who depend on me. Those 7 men died so that thousands of children can continue attending school safely. Is that a trade-off I'm comfortable with? No. Is it a trade-off I'm willing to make? Yes. I spent the rest of that day visiting the schools in the disputed territory, talking to teachers and students and parents who had been terrified that their educational opportunities might disappear. Their relief was palpable, their gratitude genuine, their trust in our organization reinforced by our decisive response. But I also spent time thinking about the families of the 7 dead men, about children who would grow up without fathers, about the cycle of violence that made such calculations necessary in the first place. That night, I called my sister Carmen. "I think I'm becoming someone I don't recognize," I told her. "Good or bad?" she asked. "I don't know. More complex, definitely. More willing to accept moral trade-offs I would have rejected before. More focused on practical outcomes than theoretical principles." "That sounds like growing up," Carmen said. "Like learning that the real world requires more sophisticated ethical frameworks than the simple rules they teach children." But what if I'm just rationalizing? What if I'm becoming complicit in things that are genuinely wrong because I love someone who's involved in those things? "Then you'll figure it out and make different choices," Carmen said practically. "But you can't make those decisions from the outside, looking in. You can only make them from where you are, with the information and options you actually have." Her words stayed with me over the following weeks as I continued learning what it meant to be part of an organization that operated outside legal boundaries but inside moral ones, that used violence to protect peace, that funded humanitarian work through criminal activities. I was changing, becoming someone more pragmatic and less idealistic, more willing to accept complexity and less attached to moral absolutes. Whether that was growth or corruption remained to be seen. 1 year after joining Cartel de la Sierra, I had my first major professional success. Working with our education teams, I had developed a comprehensive trauma-informed curriculum that addressed not just academic subjects but emotional regulation, conflict resolution, and community building. The program recognized that children in our territories had experienced levels of violence and instability that traditional educational approaches couldn't accommodate. The results were remarkable. Test scores improved, but more importantly, behavioral incidents decreased, student engagement increased, and families reported feeling more connected to their communities. We were measuring success not just in academic achievement, but in psychological resilience and social cohesion. "This is exactly what I hoped you would bring to the organization," Valeria said as we reviewed the program evaluations. "Not just individual therapy, but systemic approaches to community mental health." "It feels like real work," I admitted. "Like something that matters in ways my old job never did." "Because it is real work. You're addressing root causes instead of just treating symptoms, working at a scale where change actually makes a difference in people's lives." The success led to expansion opportunities, similar programs in other territories, adaptation for adult education initiatives, integration with healthcare and economic development projects. I found myself traveling throughout our region, consulting on community psychology approaches that could address the mental health impacts of poverty, violence, and social instability. But success also brought increased visibility and responsibility. My name appeared on organizational charts that law enforcement agencies studied. My programs were mentioned in intelligence reports that government officials reviewed. I was no longer just Valeria's girlfriend who happened to work for the organization. I was a key figure in our operations, someone whose capture or elimination would significantly disrupt our community services. "Are you comfortable with that level of exposure?" Valeria asked during one of our security briefings. "I'm not sure comfort is the right word," I said. "But I'm committed to the work, and this is what the work requires." She studied my face with the careful attention she gave to all important strategic assessments. "You've changed," she observed. "From when you first came back, from when you were deciding whether to join us officially. You're more settled, more confident about your place here." "I've found purpose," I said. "Work that matters, a role that uses my skills in meaningful ways, a community that values what I contribute. That's more than most people ever find in their careers." "Even considering the moral compromises?" I thought about the question while watching security monitors that showed our various facilities: schools where children learned to read, clinics where families received health care, community centers where adults developed job skills, distribution centers where illegal products were packaged for shipment to distant markets. "I've stopped thinking in terms of moral compromises," I said finally. "I think in terms of complex systems where every choice has multiple consequences, where moral purity is often an obstacle to actual positive change. That's a very sophisticated way of saying you've made peace with working for a criminal organization. I've made peace with working for an organization that's transforming itself and its communities in ways that government programs and legal nonprofits never could, I corrected. The criminal activities are means to an end, not the end itself. And if law enforcement shuts us down? If new policies or rival organizations disrupt what we've built? Then we adapt. Find new approaches, new funding sources, new ways to serve the same goals. The specific methods matter less than the underlying commitment to community development. I was echoing language I had heard Valeria use in strategic planning sessions, frameworks I had absorbed through months of organizational meetings and operational briefings. But the words felt authentic rather than borrowed, reflective of genuine understanding rather than superficial adoption of institutional rhetoric. I love seeing you like this, Valeria said. Confident, purposeful, fully present instead of holding part of yourself in reserve. I love being like this, I admitted. I love feeling like my work matters, like my skills are being used effectively, like I'm part of something larger than individual client relationships. No regrets about the life you gave up? The normal career, the legal safety, the moral simplicity. The moral simplicity was an illusion, I said. Working in traditional mental health meant accepting that most of my clients would never escape the systemic problems that created their individual symptoms. I could help people cope with poverty, but I couldn't address poverty itself. I could treat trauma, but I couldn't prevent the social conditions that created trauma. And now you can? Now I'm part of an organization that's actually changing those social conditions. Not perfectly, not without cost, but meaningfully. That feels more moral to me than maintaining personal ethical purity while leaving systemic problems unchanged. Valeria smiled then, the deep satisfied smile of someone who had made a successful long-term investment. Welcome to the revolution, she said. Glad you decided to stay. 2 years into my tenure with Cartel de la Sierra, Valeria and I faced our first major relationship crisis since my return. The crisis wasn't about her work or my adaptation to criminal life. It was about something much more mundane and universal. We had different ideas about what our future should look like. I wanted to get married. Not for legal reasons or social convention, but because I wanted the emotional commitment that came with public declaration of permanent partnership. After years of uncertainty and separation, I craved the stability of knowing that whatever challenges we faced, we would face them as an officially committed team. Valeria was resistant to the idea, though she struggled to articulate why. Marriage feels like a luxury for people who live normal lives, she said during one of our many conversations about the topic. People who don't have to worry about assassination attempts or government surveillance or rival organizations using personal relationships as tactical weaknesses. Those same risks exist whether we're married or just living together, I pointed out. The commitment is already there emotionally. Marriage just acknowledges it publicly. Public acknowledgement creates vulnerabilities, she argued. Official records, legal documents, formal connections that can be traced and exploited. But I suspected the real issue was deeper than operational security. Valeria had spent most of her adult life avoiding emotional commitments that might be used against her, maintaining psychological distance from anything that felt permanent or binding. Marriage represented a level of vulnerability she wasn't sure she could afford. The conflict came to a head during a particularly stressful period when 3 different government agencies were investigating our financial networks, rival organizations were testing our territorial boundaries, and expansion into new markets was requiring constant strategic adjustments. I can't think about wedding planning when I'm trying to prevent a war, Valeria said after I brought up the subject again during what should have been a relaxing dinner. I'm not asking you to plan a wedding, I replied. I'm asking you to make a commitment to our relationship that acknowledges its importance in your life. Our relationship is the most important thing in my life, she said. You know that. Then why won't you marry me? Because marriage is a promise about the future, and I can't make promises about a future I might not survive to see. The honesty was brutal and loving at once. She wasn't rejecting the idea of permanent commitment because she didn't want it, but because she was afraid of making promises she might not be able to keep. Everyone who gets married faces uncertainty about the future, I said. Car accidents, cancer, job loss, natural disasters, no one knows what's coming. But they make the commitment anyway because love requires faith. My uncertainties are more specific and more immediate than car accidents, Valeria pointed out. There are people actively trying to kill me. There are government agencies actively trying to imprison me. The chances that I'll be dead or captured within 5 years are statistically significant. Then marry me now, I said. If our time together is limited, I want to spend it as your wife, not just your girlfriend. She was quiet for a long time, studying my face with the same careful attention she gave to tactical assessments and strategic decisions. Is this really about marriage, she asked finally, or about needing proof that I'm as committed to this relationship as I am to everything else in my life? The question cut to the heart of my insecurity. I had joined her organization, adapted to her world, accepted moral compromises I had never imagined making. But part of me still wondered whether I was truly her partner or just another responsibility she was managing alongside everything else. Maybe it's about both, I admitted. Then let me be clear, Valeria said, reaching across the table to take my hands. You are not just another item on my list of responsibilities. You are the reason I want to build something worth protecting. You are the person I think about when I'm making long-term strategic decisions. You are the future I'm working toward. Then marry me. Okay, she said, surprising us both. Yes. Let's get married. Planning a wedding while managing a multinational criminal organization presented unique logistical challenges. Guest list required security clearances. Venue selection involved threat assessments. Catering needed to accommodate dietary restrictions and potential poisoning attempts. Photography had to balance sentimental memories with operational security concerns. But underneath the practical complications was something beautiful and normal, two people who loved each other planning a celebration of their commitment to building a life together. Valeria insisted on a small ceremony, limited to immediate family and essential organizational members. I wanted something larger, more traditionally festive, but I understood her concerns about creating soft targets for potential enemies. We can have a bigger celebration later, she promised. When things are more stable, when security concerns are less immediate. But for the actual ceremony, I need to know that everyone present is someone we trust completely. Define completely, I said. People who would die before revealing information that could harm us. People who would protect you if something happened to me. People who understand that attending this wedding makes them permanent allies rather than casual friends. It was a sobering framework for guest list development, but it also clarified the importance of what we were doing. This wasn't just a party, it was a formal alliance between families and organizations, a public declaration of relationships that would persist beyond individual circumstances. My family's response to the wedding invitation was complicated. They loved me and wanted me to be happy, but they also understood enough about Valeria's world to be frightened by the implications of formal association. Are you sure about this, Mija? My mother asked during one of our planning conversations. Once you're married to her, you become a target for anyone who wants to hurt her. I'm already a target, I pointed out. I work for her organization, I live in her house, I'm involved in strategic decisions that affect thousands of people. Marriage doesn't change my risk profile, it just acknowledges the commitment that already exists. But marriage makes it permanent, my father added. Relationships can end, but family connections last forever. Are you ready for that level of entanglement? The question forced me to examine my own motivations more deeply. Was I seeking the security of permanent commitment, or was I trying to bind Valeria to me through legal and social obligations? Was I motivated by love, or by fear that she might eventually decide the complications of our relationship outweighed the benefits? I'm ready, I said finally. Not because I need guarantees about the future, but because I want to face whatever comes next as her partner in every sense of the word. Valeria's family was more straightforwardly supportive, though their enthusiasm was tempered by practical concerns about operational security and organizational stability. Marriage is good for leadership, Don Alvaro explained during one of our planning meetings. It signals that you're building for the long term, that you have personal investments in the community's success. People trust leaders who have families to protect. You think our marriage will be good for the organization? I asked. I think your marriage will be good for Valeria, he said. And what's good for Valeria is good for the organization. She's been carrying this weight alone for too long. Having a true partner will make her more effective, not less. But he also warned us about the potential challenges of mixing personal and professional relationships when the professional responsibilities involved life and death decisions. You'll disagree about strategy sometimes, he said. You'll have different opinions about acceptable risks, about priorities, about how to balance community needs with organizational requirements. Those disagreements could put stress on your marriage in ways that normal couples never experience. How do we prevent that from happening? Valeria asked. By remembering that you're partners, not competitors, Don Alvaro replied. By maintaining clear boundaries between personal and professional conflicts. By supporting each other even when you don't agree with each other's decisions. The advice proved prophetic. Even during the wedding planning process, we discovered areas where our approaches differed significantly. Valeria wanted maximum security and minimal exposure. I wanted meaningful celebration and family participation. She prioritized organizational stability. I prioritized emotional authenticity. But we also discovered that disagreeing didn't threaten our relationship if we approached conflicts as problems to solve together rather than battles to win individually. We learned to negotiate, to compromise, to find solutions that addressed both of our core concerns without requiring either of us to abandon our essential priorities. We're good at this, Valeria observed after successfully resolving a dispute about ceremony location. At working through problems together instead of letting them drive us apart. We've had practice, I said. 3 years of figuring out how to love each other despite impossible circumstances. No, she corrected. 3 years of learning how to love each other because of impossible circumstances. The challenges didn't threaten our relationship. They taught us how to build something stronger than individual preferences or temporary emotions. We married on a Thursday morning in the garden of Don Alvaro's compound, surrounded by grapevines and the scent of growing things. The ceremony itself was simple, traditional vows exchanged in Spanish and English, rings that had belonged to Valeria's grandmother, blessings from both of our families. But the simplicity was deceptive, concealing the complexity of what we were actually accomplishing. This wasn't just two people promising to love each other. This was the formal alliance of two families, the integration of my civilian background with her criminal enterprise, the public declaration that Dr. Isla Morales was now permanently associated with Cartel de la Sierra's leadership structure. I wore a dress my mother had sewn, white silk with delicate embroidery that told the story of our family's history. Valeria wore a suit that managed to be both elegant and practical, tailored to accommodate the weapon she carried even on her wedding day. Do you, Valeria de Castillo, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live? I do, she said, and her voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Do you, Isla Morales, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live? I do, I said, and meant it with every cell in my body. When we kissed as married partners, the assembled crowd erupted in celebration that felt both joyful and relieved, as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting to see if we would actually go through with this impossible commitment. The reception was held in the same garden, with music and dancing and food that represented both of our cultural backgrounds. For a few hours, we were able to pretend we were just another couple celebrating the beginning of married life, surrounded by friends and family who wanted nothing more than our happiness. But even during the celebration, the realities of our situation were present. Security guards positioned around the perimeter, communication devices that kept us connected to ongoing operations, the careful choreography of people who lived under constant potential threat. No regrets? Valeria asked as we danced to a song her father had loved. None, I said. This feels right. Like something I've been moving toward for years without knowing it. Even though you're now officially married to a criminal? I'm married to you, I corrected. Everything else is just context. She laughed and spun me around, and for that moment, we were just two women in love, celebrating the promise to build a life together despite every reason the world had given us to believe such a thing was impossible. We had planned a honeymoon in Costa Rica, a week of beaches and privacy and normal couple activities that would give us space to adjust to being married. Instead, we spent our first week as wives dealing with a coordinated attack by 3 rival organizations who had apparently decided that our wedding was the perfect time to test our defenses. I'm sorry, Valeria said as we reviewed intelligence reports from our secure command center instead of walking on the beach we had reserved for the occasion. This is not how I imagined starting our marriage. It's exactly how I expected to start our marriage, I replied. Crisis management and strategic planning and making decisions that affect thousands of people. If I wanted a normal honeymoon, I would have married a normal person. The attacks were sophisticated and coordinated, clearly planned over months and timed to exploit what our enemies assumed would be a moment of distraction and vulnerability. They struck simultaneously at our financial networks, our distribution infrastructure, and our community programs. But they had miscalculated. Instead of finding us unprepared and distracted, they found us more focused and determined than ever. Marriage hadn't made us vulnerable, it had given us additional motivation to protect everything we had built together. They made a strategic error, Valeria explained to her lieutenants during our response planning session. They assumed that personal happiness would make us soft, that having something to lose would make us hesitant to fight. Instead, it's made us more dangerous. The counterattack was swift and comprehensive. Within 72 hours, we had eliminated the leadership of all 3 rival organizations, secured our compromised operations, and demonstrated that Cartel de la Sierra under married leadership was more formidable than ever. How does it feel to spend your honeymoon planning military operations? I asked Valeria as we reviewed the aftermath reports. Like the most honest beginning to a marriage I could have asked for, she said. No illusions about what our life together will require, no pretense that love exists separately from the work we do. I love you too, I said, understanding what she meant. I love all of you, the wife and the leader, the woman who dances with me and the woman who eliminates threats to our community. Are you disappointed that we didn't get the romantic honeymoon you wanted? I'm proud that our first week as wives was spent protecting something we built together, I said. It feels more meaningful than a vacation would have been. That night, as we finally had a moment alone together, Valeria gave me a wedding gift I hadn't expected, a custom weapon designed specifically for my hands and training level. I know you hate the idea of carrying a gun, she said. But you're my wife now, which makes you an automatic target for anyone who wants to hurt me. I need to know you can protect yourself if I'm not there. The weapon was beautiful in its functionality, compact, precise, decorated with engravings that told the story of our relationship. It was also terrifying, a tangible reminder of the world I had fully committed myself to by marrying her. Will you teach me to use it properly? I asked. Every day, she promised. Until you're as comfortable with it as you are with psychological assessment tools. That might take a while. I spent years learning assessment techniques. We have time, Valeria said, pulling me close. We have the rest of our lives. The phrase sent a chill through me, not because I doubted our commitment, but because I understood how fragile those lives could be in the world we inhabited. But I also understood that fragility made our love more precious, not less. Made every day together a gift rather than an entitlement. I love being married to you, I said, even though our honeymoon was a war. Especially because our honeymoon was a war. It proved that we can face anything together. By our first wedding anniversary, I had learned to shoot well enough to qualify for advanced security training, had developed community psychology programs in 7 different territories, and had become comfortable with being introduced as Mrs. de Castillo, the boss's wife. The title still felt strange, but in a good way. Like wearing a piece of jewelry that marked me as belonging to someone who also belonged to me, like carrying identification that placed me permanently within a community I had chosen rather than one I had been born into. Our marriage had settled into routines that balanced the personal and professional aspects of our partnership. Morning strategy briefings over breakfast. Evening debriefings over dinner. Weekends when we tried to focus on each other rather than organizational responsibilities. But the integration wasn't complete. There were still aspects of Valeria's work that she handled independently, decisions she made without consulting me, operations she kept me away from for reasons of security or plausible deniability. I want to be more involved, I told her during one of our anniversary celebration dinners. Not just in the humanitarian programs, but in the overall strategic planning. I want to understand the complete picture of what we're building together. Some things are better kept compartmentalized, she said. The less you know about certain operations, the more legal protection you maintain if things go wrong. I don't want legal protection. I want partnership. Full partnership in everything we do. Valeria was quiet for a long time, considering the implications of what I was asking for. Full partnership means full responsibility, she said finally. Full complicity in everything we do, including the parts that cause harm. Are you ready for that level of moral weight? I've been carrying moral weight since the day I joined this organization, I pointed out. The humanitarian programs I develop are funded by drug money. The communities I serve are protected by violence. I'm already complicit, I just want to be complicit with full knowledge rather than partial understanding. And if that knowledge changes how you feel about the work? If seeing the complete picture makes you want to leave? Then I'll leave, I said. But I'll leave as your wife who made an informed decision, not as someone who is protected from uncomfortable truths. She nodded slowly, as if accepting the logic of an argument she had been having with herself for months. All right, she said. Full partnership. But once you know everything, you can't unknow it. Once you're involved in strategic decisions that affect life and death, you can't claim innocence if law enforcement comes after us. I understand. And once you're part of the complete leadership structure, you become a target for elimination, not just leverage. Our enemies will consider you as much of a threat as they consider me. I understand that too. The next morning, Valeria brought me into the innermost circle of Cartel de la Sierra's leadership structure. I learned about operations I had never suspected, alliances I had never imagined, strategic objectives that extended decades into the future. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The scope of what we controlled, the complexity of what we managed, the delicate balance between legal and illegal operations that kept everything functioning, it was like seeing the blueprint of a shadow government that operated parallel to official institutions. Now you understand why I look tired all the time, Valeria said as we concluded my first complete strategic briefing. Every decision affects thousands of people. Every mistake could destabilize entire regions. Every success creates new responsibilities and complications. How do you make decisions with stakes this high? I asked. The same way you make any important decision, she said. You gather the best available information, consult with people whose judgment you trust, consider both immediate and long-term consequences, and then choose the option that serves your core values while minimizing harm. And when all the options cause some kind of harm? Then you choose the option that causes the least harm while creating the most good. You accept that perfect solutions don't exist, and you take responsibility for the consequences of whatever choice you make. I was beginning to understand that leadership at this level wasn't about having the right answers, but about being willing to make difficult decisions with incomplete information and live with the results. It was about accepting responsibility for outcomes you couldn't completely control while still working toward goals you believed in. 3 years into our marriage, Cartel de la Sierra had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. We controlled legitimate businesses that employed over 200,000 people across 4 countries. Our humanitarian programs served more than 1 million people annually. Our educational initiatives had produced doctors, engineers, teachers, and community leaders who were transforming their regions through legal means. But we also moved approximately 40% of the cocaine that flowed through Central America into North American markets, maintained private armies larger than some national militaries, and influenced political processes at every level from local elections to international trade agreements. The contradictions had become so complex that traditional categories of legal and illegal, moral and immoral, seemed inadequate to describe what we had built. "We've created something new," I observed during one of our strategic planning retreats. "Not just a criminal organization that does some good things, and not just a legitimate business that has criminal origins. Something that transcends those categories entirely." "A parallel state," Valeria agreed. "Providing services that official governments can't or won't provide, funded through markets that official economies can't or won't acknowledge, accountable to communities rather than abstract legal frameworks." "Is that sustainable long-term?" "Only if we continue evolving. Only if we keep transitioning toward legitimate revenue sources, while maintaining the community investments that justify our existence. Only if we stay ahead of law enforcement efforts to shut us down and rival organizations trying to destroy what we've built." The conversation took place during what should have been a vacation, 2 weeks in a private resort where we could focus on long-term strategic thinking rather than daily crisis management. But even our vacations had become working retreats, opportunities to step back from immediate pressures and consider larger questions about direction and purpose. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of just being a killer?" I asked as we sat by the pool, reviewing economic development proposals between swimming laps. Valeria laughed, but there was melancholy underneath the humor. "Sometimes. There was a clarity to violence that leadership doesn't have. When someone threatened what you protected, you eliminated the threat. Simple cause and effect, immediate resolution. And now every problem has 17 different aspects. Each solution creates 3 new complications, and every success generates additional responsibilities. It's more rewarding in the long run, but much more exhausting day to day." "Do you think we'll ever be able to step back? To find the peaceful life we used to dream about?" "I think we're building toward that possibility," she said. "Each year, a higher percentage of our revenue comes from legitimate sources. Each year, more of our community programs become self-sustaining. Each year, we need violence less and diplomacy more." "How long?" "Maybe another decade before we could step back from operational leadership while maintaining the institutional stability we've created. Maybe 2 decades before the transition to complete legitimacy is irreversible." I tried to imagine myself at 45, 55, still managing the complexity of what we had built, but with less personal risk and more conventional respectability. It seemed both appealing and somehow anticlimactic after the intensity of what we were currently living. "Would you want to?" I asked. "Step back, I mean. Live quietly somewhere with a normal relationship to power and responsibility." Valeria considered the question while eating chocolate, a ritual that had evolved from desperate comfort-seeking to conscious meditation on what mattered most in life. "I want to live to be an old woman," she said finally. "I want to see what we've built become self-sustaining. I want to watch children who attended our schools grow up to lead their communities through legitimate means. I want to know that the violence I've caused served some larger purpose. But I also want to die knowing that I used whatever time I had to create as much positive change as possible. If stepping back means less impact, less ability to address systemic problems, less capacity to protect vulnerable communities, then maybe the peaceful life isn't worth the cost." It was the kind of conversation that would have been impossible during our first relationship, when she was consumed by survival and I was overwhelmed by the moral complexity of loving her. Now, as married partners with years of shared experience building something together, we could discuss philosophical questions about purpose and legacy with a kind of depth that only came from genuinely understanding each other's values and commitments. "I love that we can talk about these things," I said. "I love that we've built enough trust and understanding to be completely honest about our fears and ambitions and ethical frameworks." "It's what I always hoped marriage could be," Valeria agreed. "Not just romantic love, but true partnership in thinking through the biggest questions about how to live meaningfully. Even when those questions involve managing criminal enterprises and military organizations." "Especially then," she said. "Love is easy when life is simple. The real test is whether you can maintain connection and mutual respect when facing impossible choices together." 5 years into our marriage, we faced our first serious conversation about having children. Not because either of us had sudden biological urges or social pressure to reproduce, but because several of the families in our organization had children who were growing up within our community, and we found ourselves thinking about generational responsibility in new ways. What kind of world are we creating for the next generation? I asked during one of our evening walks through the compound gardens. What kind of inheritance are we leaving for children who will grow up knowing this is normal? A world with more opportunities and better infrastructure than we found, Valeria said. A world where communities have resources to solve their own problems rather than depending on distant governments or foreign aid organizations. But also a world where violence is always an option, where moral compromise is built into economic systems, where power relationships are maintained through implicit threats. As opposed to the official world, where violence is outsourced to police and military organizations, where moral compromise is hidden behind legal frameworks, where power relationships are maintained through systemic inequality. She had a point. The parallel state we had built wasn't perfect, but it wasn't obviously worse than the official systems it operated alongside. In some ways, it was more honest about its methods and more accountable to the people it served. But would you want to raise a child in this environment? I pressed. Would you want our son or daughter to grow up thinking that running a criminal organization is a normal career path? Valeria was quiet for a long time, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I would want to raise a child who understood that leadership requires accepting responsibility for difficult choices, she said finally. A child who learned to think systemically about problems, who developed skills for managing complexity and ambiguity, who felt connected to something larger than personal success. You could teach those things without the criminal enterprise. Could I? Would a child raised in conventional middle-class comfort develop the same depth of understanding about power, responsibility, and social change? Would they have the same motivation to address systemic problems rather than just managing personal circumstances? I thought about my own upbringing, comfortable, loving, protected from most of the harsh realities that shaped people like Valeria. Had that protection prepared me to understand the world as it actually existed, or had it left me naive about how change really happened? Maybe the question isn't whether to have children, I said, but how to raise them if we do. How to give them enough understanding of the world to be effective leaders without traumatizing them the way you were traumatized. How to teach them to be strong without breaking them, Valeria agreed. How to prepare them for responsibility without stealing their childhood. Is that possible? Can you teach someone to carry this kind of weight without putting the weight on them directly? I don't know, she admitted, but maybe that's the experiment worth trying. Maybe that's our contribution to the next generation, figuring out how to raise children who can lead meaningful change without having to survive the kind of trauma that usually creates that motivation. The conversation planted a seed that grew over the following months. Not an immediate decision to start trying for children, but a serious consideration of what parenthood might look like within the context of the life we had built. We consulted with families in our organization who were raising children, seeking advice about maintaining security while providing normal childhood experiences. We discussed educational approaches that would prepare children for eventual leadership roles without overwhelming them with adult responsibilities. We considered the logistics of child rearing when both parents carried significant professional responsibilities and personal security risks. But mostly, we talked about values. What we would want to pass on to the next generation, what we would want them to understand about the world, what kind of people we would hope they would become. I want them to be brave, Valeria said during one of these conversations. Not reckless, but willing to take risks for things that matter. Willing to challenge systems that don't serve people well. I want them to be kind, I added. Able to see other people's humanity even in conflict situations. Able to build bridges instead of just defending territory. I want them to be smart about power, she continued. To understand how it works, how to use it responsibly, how to recognize when they're being manipulated or when they're manipulating others. I want them to have choices, I said. To grow up with enough resources and education and support that they can choose their own path, rather than having circumstances choose for them. It was an ambitious list for any parent, but especially for parents whose daily work involved managing criminal enterprises and military operations. Could we really raise children who embody those values while living within systems that sometimes required violence, deception, and moral compromise? Maybe the challenge is part of the value, Valeria suggested. Maybe learning to maintain personal integrity within complex systems is exactly the skill the next generation will need to create better systems. Or maybe we're rationalizing, I said. Maybe we just want children and we're constructing elaborate justifications for exposing them to our world. Both could be true, she acknowledged. We could want children for personal reasons and also believe that raising them well could serve larger purposes. Are you ready for that responsibility? On top of everything else we're managing. Valeria smiled then, the kind of smile that held both anticipation and determination. I've been ready since I first understood what it meant to build something that would last beyond my own lifetime, she said. The question is whether you're ready to be a parent in this context, with these complications. I looked around the garden where we were walking, at the security measures that kept us safe and the beauty that made life meaningful, at the evidence of everything we had built together over years of impossible choices and unwavering commitment. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Starting the adoption process while running a criminal organization presented unique challenges I had never encountered in psychology textbooks. Home studies required security clearances. Background checks needed careful legal navigation. Social worker visits had to be scheduled around operational security requirements. Even choosing an adoption agency became an intelligence consideration. But underneath the operational complications was something pure and transformative. The gradual awareness that we were preparing to welcome new life into our family, that our love was expanding to embrace a child who would carry our legacy forward. How are you feeling about becoming a mother through adoption? My own mother asked during one of her carefully secured visits to the compound. Terrified and excited in equal measure, I said honestly. I have no idea how to balance protecting our child from this world while also preparing them to eventually understand their place in it. You'll figure it out as you go, she said with the confidence of someone who had raised 4 children successfully. All parents make it up as they go along, regardless of their circumstances. Not all parents are worried about assassination attempts and government surveillance when they're going through adoption proceedings. No, she agreed. But all parents worry about giving their children the tools they'll need to navigate whatever world they'll inherit. Your challenges are just more specific than most people's. Valeria's response to our adoption process was protective in ways that would have been claustrophobic if I hadn't understood the genuine dangers that motivated her concern. Additional security measures for agency meetings, modified travel schedules, backup plans for emergency situations that might require immediate relocation of our future child. The social workers are going to think we're paranoid, I reminded her when the precautions started feeling excessive. Normal families don't require this level of security infrastructure for adoption processes. Most families aren't headed by cartel leaders, she pointed out. Most families don't represent strategic targets for rival organizations. Most families' adoptions don't affect the stability of criminal enterprises spanning 4 countries. Do you think our enemies would actually target our child? I think our enemies would target our child specifically because we love them, she said grimly. Nothing would destabilize me more effectively than threatening our family. The reality check was sobering but not surprising. I had known when I committed to this life that personal vulnerability would always be a strategic consideration, that love would always create tactical weaknesses alongside emotional strengths. Then we plan accordingly, I said. We take reasonable precautions without letting fear control our choices. We prepare for threats without assuming they're inevitable. Are you scared? She asked. Of potential dangers? Sometimes. Of being parents through adoption? Constantly. But I'm not scared of welcoming this child with you. I'm not scared of raising someone who grows up understanding that meaningful work requires accepting responsibility for complex choices. What if we mess this up? What if our child grows up damaged by exposure to this world? Then we'll love them anyway and help them heal, I said. The same way you've been healing from your own childhood trauma while building something better for other people's children. I never thought of it that way. You've spent 15 years trying to create the kind of community that would have protected you when you were 6 years old, I pointed out. Maybe being parents will teach us new things about healing our own wounds while preventing similar wounds in the next generation. Valeria looked at the adoption paperwork spread across our dining table, documents that represented months of legal navigation and security considerations. I want to be a good parent, she said. I want to give our child everything I never had: safety, choices, unconditional love. You already are a good parent, I said. You're already thinking about their well-being, already planning how to protect them while preparing them for responsibility. The fact that you're worried about messing up is probably proof that you won't. How can you be so confident? Because I've watched you lead thousands of people with wisdom and compassion despite having no training for that kind of responsibility. Because I've seen you make impossible decisions while maintaining your humanity. Because you've built something meaningful out of the worst circumstances imaginable. Being a parent is different from being a leader. Is it? Both require putting someone else's needs ahead of your own. Both require making decisions with incomplete information. Both require teaching by example rather than just words. That night, as we lay in bed discussing adoption timelines and nursery designs and all the ordinary concerns of prospective parents, I felt a sense of completion I had never experienced before. Not because our life together was ending, but because it was expanding in ways that connected us to something larger than our own relationship. We're really doing this, Valeria said, reviewing adoption agency brochures. We're really doing this, I agreed. Preparing to welcome new life into the middle of everything else we're building. Adding parenthood to leadership, family planning to strategic planning. I love you, she said. I love the life we've created together, and I love that we're creating space for new life to share it with us. I love you too, I said. All of you. The woman who eats chocolate and dreams of her father, the leader who builds schools and eliminates threats, the partner who shares everything with me, and the future parent who's already protecting our child before we've even brought them home. I'm sitting in the same restaurant in Merida where this all began, eating chocolate while our daughter plays with blocks at my feet and my wife reviews intelligence reports on her secure tablet. Sophia is 4 years old, bilingual, curious about everything, and completely comfortable with the armed guards who follow us everywhere. Mama Isla, why does that man have a gun? She asks with the casual interest children show in unfamiliar objects. Because it's his job to keep us safe, I say, the same answer I've given to dozens of similar questions about security measures, encrypted phones, and the reason we can't just walk into stores without advance planning. Why do we need to be kept safe? Because Mama Val's work is very important, and sometimes important work makes people who don't understand it feel angry or scared. It's a simplified explanation, but not an inaccurate one. Sophia will learn more as she gets older, will gradually understand the complexity of the world she was born into. For now, she knows that her mothers love her, that she has more educational opportunities than most children, that her community is safe and prosperous, and that grown-ups sometimes have to make difficult decisions to protect the things they care about. Valeria has aged gracefully into her 30s, the sharp edges of her younger years softened by marriage, parenthood, and the gradual transition from survival-focused leadership to legacy-focused institution building. Cartel de la Sierra now operates more like a multinational corporation with unconventional subsidiaries than a traditional criminal organization. How are the education metrics looking? I ask as she closes the intelligence briefing and opens a different report. Incredible, she says, smiling at statistics that would have seemed impossible when we first started developing community programs. High school graduation rates in our territories are now higher than national averages. College enrollment has increased by 300% over the past 5 years. Youth involvement in criminal activities has decreased by 80%. And the economic indicators? Even better. Unemployment is virtually non-existent in our regions. Average household income has tripled. Small business development is thriving. We're actually becoming victims of our own success. People are moving to our territories for opportunities, which creates new infrastructure demands. It's the kind of success story that governments dream of achieving through official programs, accomplished through methods those same governments would consider completely unacceptable. The contradiction no longer bothers me the way it used to. Results matter more than methods when those results are transforming entire regions for the better. Mama Val, Sophia says, climbing onto Valeria's lap with the confident presumption of a beloved child. Tell me the story about Grandpa Papa. It's her favorite bedtime story, a sanitized version of her grandfather's life that emphasizes his love for growing things, his dedication to family, and his dream of building communities where children could be safe and happy. She doesn't yet know about the violence or the tragedy, but she understands that she comes from a family of people who work hard to protect others. Once upon a time, Valeria begins, settling Sophia on her lap while continuing to scan security updates, there was a man who loved the earth so much that he could make anything grow. I watch them together, my wife telling our daughter stories that connect her to a legacy of love and responsibility, creating narrative frameworks that will help her understand her inheritance without overwhelming her with its weight. This is what we've built. Not just economic development or political influence or even the successful transition from criminal organization to something more complex and ultimately more beneficial. We've built a family, a community, a set of institutions that will persist beyond our individual lives. And he taught his daughter that the most important thing in the world, Valeria continues the story, was to use whatever power you have to make life better for people who need help. Sophia nods seriously, absorbing lessons about responsibility and service that will shape her understanding of what it means to inherit privilege. When she's older, she'll learn about the moral complexity of how that power was acquired and maintained. For now, she's learning about how it can be used. My phone buzzes with a text from my sister Carmen. How's married life treating you? Like the most complicated adventure I could have imagined, I text back. And the most worthwhile. Any regrets? I look around the restaurant where I first met Valeria, at the woman who has become my partner in everything from strategic planning to bedtime stories, at the daughter who represents our hope for a future where leadership and love can coexist more easily than they have for our generation. None, I text back. Not one. Because this is what love looks like when it's tested by impossible circumstances and refined by years of choosing each other over easier alternatives. This is what partnership means when it encompasses both personal devotion and shared responsibility for thousands of other lives. Are you happy? Valeria asks, noticing my contemplative mood. I'm everything, I say. Happy, scared, proud, overwhelmed, grateful, determined, everything at once. Is that what happiness feels like when life gets complicated enough? That's what happiness feels like when life gets meaningful enough, she corrects, leaning over to kiss me while Sophia continues playing with her blocks, completely secure in a world her parents have built around protecting what matters most. The story isn't over. It probably never will be, because building something worth protecting is work that continues across generations. But sitting here in this restaurant where we first found each other, surrounded by the evidence of everything we've created together, I understand that some stories don't need endings. They just need the commitment to keep writing new chapters. Sophia looks up from her blocks and smiles at both of us, the expression of someone who has never doubted that she is loved completely and unconditionally. In that smile, I see the future we're working toward, a world where children can grow up feeling safe enough to be kind, secure enough to be brave, loved enough to love others in return. Ice cream? Sophia asks hopefully. Ice cream, Valeria and I agree simultaneously, and we pack up our various reports and security devices and family belongings to continue the adventure of building a meaningful life together, one decision at a time.